Would you like to get your Canon R8 set up for wildlife photography? I've been playing with it for a few months. I've dialed in my settings and I'm going to share them with you now. Let's hop right into it. Here on the first tab, I'm choosing C-RAW over RAW. I find C-RAW isn't degrading the quality at all, and I'm getting a lot better buffer, which is getting me a lot more keepers because my camera isn't thinking during that buffering phase. Here on the second tab, I'm not changing anything. I'm leaving all this auto stuff off. I just make sure that my metering mode is on evaluative metering, which is just going to weigh the whole scene in helping to determine that exposure. Here on the fourth tab, I make sure I'm in auto white balance, and picture style I just set to standard. It's not going to affect your raw file, but it does affect what you see in your viewfinder. Here on the fifth tab, I also leave all this lens aberration, noise reduction, all that stuff off. I'm going to handle that in Lightroom later on when I get home with my photos. Here on the sixth tab, I leave all this stuff disabled. You could do raw burst mode, where when you halfway press the shutter, it starts putting pictures in the memory of the camera in the buffer, and if you start shooting, it's kind of like a little magic trick where the camera actually started shooting before you fully press the shutter button. It is useful. I played with it some. I do enjoy it, but you need Canon software in order to take the pictures out, and it's just kind of a mess. I don't feel like it's quite there. If Lightroom makes it where I can open that file, because it puts it all in one file, and then you got to go in and choose the frame and take it out. The quality's good, but right now it's just a little gimmicky to me, so it's not quite my thing, but feel free to play with it. Turn it on if you want to. Here in the seventh tab, drive mode, I choose H over H+. H+ is 40 frames per second. H is 20 frames per second. Coming from a background of shooting the 6D, which was 4 or 5 frames per second, 20 is plenty for me. It gives me a ton of photos to go through. But if you're shooting some really fast action, feel free to use that H+ and get 40 frames per second in electronic shutter mode. And I don't think you're going to miss anything. Right here I have silent shutter function off, shutter mode electronic, release shutter without card, you want that off. You forgot your memory card, you want your camera to tell you it's not in there, you don't want to spend all day thinking you're happily taking pictures, go home and there's nothing there. So I definitely make sure that setting is off. Here in the eighth tab, I turn on my image stabilizer. So when I press that little record button on top of the camera to shoot some video, it has a image stabilization applied. This camera doesn't have IBIS, but it does have digital image stabilization, which works pretty well. Also make sure I have touch shutter disabled and image review off. I don't want the shutter to fire when I touch the back of my screen, and I don't want to automatically review my image because it'll pop it up on that display and I might miss some action. I only want to review the image when I press on the playback button. On the ninth tab, under display performance, I choose smooth. I don't find it affects the battery that much, and it gives you just easier to track animals in your viewfinder. I also make sure my display simulation is set to exposure, so I get a little preview of my exposure in that viewfinder as well. On the 10th tab, the only thing I'm changing is my movie recording size. I want it 4K, 60 frames per second, IPB. And this relates to the record button on the top of the camera. When you're in picture mode, if you press that, it'll start shooting video, and everything except for these settings is pretty much automatic. So it's going to adjust the exposure and all that stuff itself, but I do want to shoot in slow motion so I can slow it down later on. I do want 4K and I do want the full IPB format. Onto the purple menu, we are now looking at the autofocus settings. The first thing I want to do is make sure it is set to servo. That means that it's going to attempt to track the subject that's moving around, not on one shot. We are going to set up an option for one shot here later in the video, and I'll show you when you would use that then. Autofocus area, I have it on spot. That's going to help you really nail the eyeball of a critter when these other settings fail you, so we'll look at that here in a second as well. Whole area tracking servo autofocus, I want that off. We do use it, but we're going to customize a button for that so that we have a couple different ways to shoot this camera here. Subject to detect, I want it on animals. I want it eye detection auto. I have been finding the best luck with switching track subjects to 1, so you can go one way and it's less sticky, or you can go the other way and it's more sticky on that subject. Focus mode, autofocus. Now you can also go into subjects to detect and do vehicles or people. So vehicles like your cars, your motorcycles, stuff like that. Something neat to know, if you're doing motorcycles and you have all this turned on, it will attempt to get not the eye, but the helmet of the person on the motorcycle. If you're shooting volleyball, things like that, you're going to want subject to detect on person. Here on tab 2, you have your different cases. These are different kind of AI scenarios for what you might be shooting. I find automatic works the best, but feel free to go through these. You have some that'll work if a critter or a person quickly comes in the scene, it'll try and track that. You have some where if what you're tracking goes behind a pole or something, it'll try and stay sticky to that person or critter or vehicle instead of locking on the pole. And you have some for just really fast moving subjects. I have found auto works the best, but feel free to go through and play with these for the scenario that best works for you. On to tab 3, I leave lens drive when autofocus is impossible on. That's going to give you that hunting. So if a bird's flying through the air and you're trying to find it in the viewfinder, it's going to keep kind of running through the focus range until it can focus on it, and then it's going to lock it in. AF assist beam firing. For wildlife, I leave that off. Fires a little LED light to help with focusing. Going to scare your critter. Don't want to do it. If you're doing sports or something like that, you could be distracting the players. I say for these scenarios, just leave it off. I do turn it on when I'm doing still life or landscape, macro, things like that. But for things when you're dealing with live people or animals, I just don't like it. Touch and drag. I turn this on, and what this does is it allows you, since this camera doesn't have a joystick, it allows you to use your display screen as a joystick. So you can put your thumb on there. You got to make sure your nose isn't touching it too, or it kind of throws it off. But you can put your thumb on the screen finder, move your thumb around, and it moves around that focus point. If you're not locking on with the autofocus eye detection, which really works most of the time, this is just another way to put that point where you want it and focus in. So when you choose that setting, it has a few different options here to where you can set up that kind of faux joystick to work. I like it set all the way over to the right, but you could set it to the left bottom, left top, right bottom, center. You can really set it up anywhere you want it. So this really overcomes one of the negatives of this camera, and that's that it's missing some of the controls and dials that your higher end cameras have, but I find this works great. I use it all the time. I don't change anything else in tab 4. Tab 5, I like manual focus peaking on, and I like it high, and I like it red. And what that's going to do when you need to manually focus, your autofocus is failing you, so you just start turning your focus ring. It'll still allow you to manually focus, and it will highlight in red the sharpest, most detailed parts of the image, and that is great. I also turn on lens electronic manual focus magnify, and we'll get to that here towards the end of the video. When all other things are failing you, we're going to switch to one spot. We're going to zoom in and magnify right on your critter's eye, and that's going to allow you to nail that perfect focus. Now on to the next menu, the blue menu, your playback menu. There's only two things we're going to change here. That is magnification. I want to make sure it's on actual size, so when I zoom in on my playback image, I get a real good view of where I focused in and if it's sharp. The other thing I'm going to change is I'm going to turn on highlight alert, so when I look back at that image, it's going to highlight the areas where the image is blown out, let you know if you nailed your exposure or not. Now we're in the purple menu. This is kind of the connecting the smartphones, computers, and all that stuff. There is one thing we want to change here, very important, at least I want to change it. I'm not sharing images until I get home. I'm not connecting to a monitor or anything like that. I'm out in the field, I'm shooting wildlife, I'm coming home, I'm doing everything else. So in this situation, turn on airplane mode. I'm telling you guys, it overcomes another negative of this camera, one that everybody's complaining about, the battery life. If you turn on airplane mode, it's not always searching for these different connections, and I would think it almost doubles the battery life. I'm very rarely, even when I'm out for 2-3 hours, changing the battery. If I'm out 3 hours, I might have to change it once. At first, I was really disappointed with the battery life like everybody else, but if you turn on airplane mode, I promise you, you're going to get better performance out of that battery. Hey guys, just a quick break here to say that this video is sponsored by me. I'm not only a photographer, but I also write Western novels, and if that's your thing, I'll link them down below. It's really good stories destined for the big screen with strong male and female characters, so check it out. Now we're in the yellow menu. There's only a couple things we're going to change here. I disable beep so I'm not scaring my critters. I leave my screen brightness on 4. I find it's pretty good, but I turn my viewfinder brightness all the way up to 5, so when I look in there I can just get a really good look of whether I nailed my image or not, and when I'm shooting images I get a really good view of what I'm looking at. Power saving, I leave my screen dimmer to 30 seconds. Screen off, I disable. I don't want to have to wake the camera up when I'm shooting wildlife. If I was doing landscape, I would have it set to 1 or 2 minutes. Auto power off, 5 minutes. So if I haven't seen anything in a long time, I'm on a hike, I don't want it to drain my battery, I will let it auto power off after 5 minutes. And viewfinder off, 1 minute. These are just the settings I like, but you can go ahead and play with those and set them up how you would do it for your personal situation. That is it for our yellow menu. Now we're on to the orange menu, and this is where we're going to do some customizing. Nothing on the first tab, nothing on the second tab, third tab, very important. So we're going to go in and we're going to customize some buttons for different scenarios when we're out in the field. And this is where this all really comes together. I hope it helps you guys out. So the first thing I want to look at is the customized ring. That's the control ring on the camera if you're using an RF lens. There's 2 different ways I like to set this up. If I'm going full manual, I want to control the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO. I will set that control ring up for the ISO. So I can just take this ring here, spin it, and I can quickly control my ISO. I'm looking through the viewfinder. I'm seeing the exposure in real time. I can make sure I'm exposing for the critter and not for the shadows or the highlights. It's really fast. It works really good. However, on this full frame camera, the R8, it handles high ISO really nice. So what I prefer to do is set that control ring up for exposure compensation, and I will shoot auto ISO. So now I'm turning the control ring to get my exposure to shoot for the critter, making sure it's not choosing the highlights or the shadows automatically, and I'm letting the camera decide on the ISO. I'm finding it's giving me a few more keepers. And before we really had this control ring on my older cameras, I always shot auto ISO anyways. You want your aperture wide open to let in the most light because you're shooting at such a high shutter speed. So I am doing 1/1250. And that's just my starting point for shutter. If a critter is staying still, I'll dial it back. With this image stabilization in my 100-400, I can handhold at 1/200 and still get some pretty good images if the critter's not moving. If the critter's moving fast, I'll bump it up to 1/2000 to really freeze that action and just let the camera control the ISO. My aperture's already all the way open. My shutter speed has to be determined to freeze the action or to get a sharp image if it's standing still. So really the ISO isn't really that debatable. It has to be what it has to be. And if the scene's too dark, you're not going to get a great image anyways. You're going to bring it home, you're going to run denoise on it, and you're going to try and save it. But with this camera, you can shoot at really high ISOs. And with this new denoise, you can really denoise a high ISO image. So I'm just finding that that works best for me. When I was shooting on a crop frame camera that didn't handle ISO quite as well, that's when I had the ISO set to the control ring because I wanted to keep it down as low as I possibly could. And if I had to sacrifice shutter a little, I would. But now I'm just kind of going with it is what it is. The shutter's the most important thing to me to freeze the action. And if something's not happening fast, I'll go with a slower shutter speed and it'll automatically lower the ISO. I hope all that makes sense to you guys. Give it a shot. You can really do it either way, but that's what's working for me. I used to find exposure compensation, putting it on a button was kind of a pain. It was slow, but with it on that control ring, it is just really fast. If the critter's head's too dark, I can just turn it one way. If it's too bright, I can turn it the other. I'm exposing for the critter just like that. Now under custom buttons, we're setting this up for back button focusing. The shutter button's just going to meter the scene and help you get exposure. So we want to set it to half press metering start. When you full press, it's going to take the picture. The next button I change is the multifunction button. They're on the front of the camera, and I have that set up to just bring my autofocus point back to 0. So you've been using that touch and drag, your autofocus point's way up in the left corner. You press that button, it brings it back to the center of your viewfinder. Very helpful. Our AF on button is the next button we're going to set up for focusing, and that is going to start our eye detection. So when you press that AF on button, that is you autofocusing with the eye detection. It's going to try and find the critter. It finds the critter. It's going to find the head. It finds the head. It's going to find the eye. It works really good most of the time. 90% of the time it works great. If it doesn't work, we have two other options. So the star button on back of your camera, we are going to set that to autofocus, and that's going to engage the servo mode autofocus. The little blue or purple box is going to track your critter once it's locked on, moving through the scene. So if it moves forward or backwards, it should follow that critter, person, vehicle, etc. So you press the autofocus on button, and it is not locking on to your critter. Now you're going to use the star button, which is your autofocus button. You're going to touch and drag your little square box to the critter, press the autofocus button. It should find them, turn purple, and lock on. If it doesn't, you can still use your focusing ring to try and get in there. These are just some backup safety options to the auto detection. The next one I find really important, which is when everything auto fails and you want to go full manual. That's your little cross button there right under the star, the 5 dots. I set that to one shot servo, so it'll switch back and forth between one shot and servo, and this is really important. So you press that button right below the star. Now you're in one shot because the auto detection wasn't working. You were trying to get a bird, you pressed your star button and it was focusing on the branch, and you really want a picture of this bird. All right, you switch to one shot by pressing that button just below the star button. You're in one shot. Now you press the star button, you turn your focus ring. We have turned on manual focus magnification. It is going to give you 10 times magnification. Now you can really see that critter's eye, and you can focus right in on it, and you can take your pictures. Now if the critter moves, you're going to have to put your autofocus point on them again, refocus again, and all that, because it's not servo, it's one shot. But there are times, especially with these little bush birds and stuff that are up in the twigs, where everything fails. And I have still gotten some really good shots by switching to one shot over servo, pressing the star button, and turning. It doesn't happen until you turn that focus ring. When you turn the focus ring, it automatically zooms in 10 times, and you can really focus on that critter. So now we have 3 options for focusing right there within your thumb's reach on back of the camera. We have the autofocus on, which starts your eye detection. We have the star button, which is your typical just autofocus, put the focus point where you want, and then we have your one-shot servo switch. So all that being right there by your thumb, I find you can't miss. Under that, I changed the 4 arrows to control your focus points if it's not already. So if you don't like the touch and drag, you can use that kind of as your joystick, but it's old Nintendo style. You know, you can go up, down, left, right. You can't go on your diagonals. It's a little difficult to use. That's why I like that touch and drag system, but whatever works for you. Tab 4 and 5, I don't change a thing, and nothing in the green menu. That's how I set this camera up. Outside of that, I have my shutter button. I roll that down if the critter's moving slow to like 1/200, 1/300. I want some fast action. I roll it up to 1/2000. Aperture, I just leave it wide open. ISO, I set to auto ISO and let the camera decide. And that control ring, I have set to exposure compensation, which just lets you say, hey, the evaluative metering is a little off. I want it a little darker or a little brighter. That'll get you there just in the snap. That's it, you guys. That's how I'm doing it. I hope it works for you. I hope this video helps you out. If it does, please let me know in the comments down below. Thank you. Have a good day.